For a quick preview of the history of the Whirlwind project, it started as something very different from what you have seen in the movie and in the comments so far. It started as an analog computer for determining the stability and the control characteristics of large aircraft. It was to be a far more advanced version of the kind of trainers used even today for training pilots in aircraft. It wasn't to train them for a known aircraft, but to take the equations of motion and the physical dimensions of an airplane and anticipate what its behavior would be, since at that time many airplanes were being built that did not control properly and did not behave well after they were finished. The idea was to simulate an aircraft with an analog computer. We took about a year to decide that any analog computer big enough to do that job would end up presenting you with a solution of its own idiosyncrasies rather than a solution of the problem at hand. And so there was a shift to serial digital computers, which were then very much the vogue, and a year was spent deciding that a serial digit transmission computer would be too slow. That was the year of 1946. 1945 had been spent in dismissing the idea of an analog computer. 1946 was spent in dismissing the idea of a serial digital computer. 1947 was the beginning of what became Whirlwind, a parallel, high-speed, synchronous machine that very soon dropped the original purpose of being an aircraft simulator and shifted over to being directed toward real-time control, in particular combat information centers, initially for the Navy, to analyze and coordinate the information from a group of radars on different ships, from submarines below the surface, and from airplanes above the surface. 1950 or 51 represented the beginning of operation of Whirlwind, and it also represented another transition away from the interests of the Navy and toward the use of the Whirlwind computer to demonstrate the feasibility of a computer-controlled air defense system. In 1951, there was a project assembled at MIT, which came about, I think, because a proposal had been made to use high-speed digital computers for the North American Continental Air Defense System at a time when the Air Force knew that its manual system was inadequate, and when there was no alternative. And then here came what appeared to be a completely crackpot and harebrained idea of using digital computers, proposed at a time when no high-speed electronic digital computer had yet operated, and proposing to use these across the whole North American continent. The Air Force was in a tremendous bind. They did not dare say no because they had no alternative. They did not dare say yes to anything this radical. During the time that that project was in session, Whirlwind actually demonstrated intercepts that I will come to later. This led to the establishment of the Lincoln Laboratory and eventually to the SAGE air defense system.
You know, I guess most of us have an awareness that computers used to be pretty big, you know, back in the archival history. The beginnings of, well, let's say 50 years ago, 1950 and so on. I think we don't really know how big they were unless we were there. These are things well, I will show you with slide number 1, which is what a computer looked like in 1950. Yes, Jeannie, thank you. I know, it looks more like a building than a computer, but that's the BARTA building, the Digital Computer Laboratory established by J. Forrester at MIT in the late 40s. And in fact, the Whirlwind machinery filled a good part of that building. Well, there were some offices and labs, oh sure. But this thing consisted of the electronics part anyway, about 8 racks, all that size. Actually, you can't see the beginning and the end of it. It extends back there quite a way. And of course, the thing was made of vacuum tubes, which are very big and very power hungry. That wasn't. No, I think that was only half of it, Tom, because, well, you see there, actually, if you look down the corridor into the machine, you'll see 8 racks, 4 on either side, progressing down toward the back. There's a guy there standing on a ladder halfway up one of the racks. I think it was a 16-bit machine. I think there were 8 bits on one side and 8 on another. Well, now, laugh not. This was actually quite interesting. More interesting, perhaps, is the darn control room. Now, these days, we think of a keyboard, perhaps, as a thing that you control a computer with. But in those days, it took a room. And you can see that's the tallest member of that collection of people you see standing is J. Forrester. And that is a collection of things felt necessary to run the Whirlwind computer. I'm not showing you all of the generators and things in the basement. This was an old printing press building, which is about the only building around. This is a few hundred yards north of the MIT campus in Cambridge. It was the only thing heavy enough around with good enough floors and so on to support the weight of this darn thing.
Here you see a glimpse of the power room. There are some motor generators in the back. It is the first time that anyone of our generation, at least, had ever seen a 1 farad capacitor. I understand they do exist these days, but a 1 farad capacitor at 200 volts stores a great deal of energy. If I did my arithmetic right, it's enough energy to lift a 1,000-pound weight 14 feet. It provided perhaps the most rapid electronic fault correction that I have ever encountered. These capacitors were made up of electrolytic capacitors, many of them plugged into sockets and connected in parallel. If one of those capacitors should age and short out, the entire 14,000 foot-pounds of energy were discharged through it. This blew the capacitor apart and out of the socket, so there was no further trouble.
There were 15,000, I think, something like 15,000 vacuum tubes in this system, and nobody had ever put that many vacuum tubes to work simultaneously before. Now, I don't know if you remember what a vacuum tube is, but they used to make switching things and amplifiers out of them, folks. And they took a lot of electricity and a lot of power. They got very hot. And 15,000 was unheard of. Jay built a team of very talented and energetic engineers who, in fact, solved the so-called reliability problem of the time, which was that collection of vacuum tubes could never possibly hope to work for more than, 7.3 seconds or something at a time before failure. And in fact, they did get that machine working very well indeed. Reliability was one of Jay Forrester's strong points. But what you have to know is that this machine, that nobody in the field in the early 1950s, knew how to make memory.
Throughout the development of Whirlwind from 1946 through 1953, the one technical problem that dominated more than anything else was the matter of what kind of storage to use, how well would it work, and would it be sufficient. We started off with a cathode ray tube of our own design, a rather complicated one because we were not very much impressed by the low signals and the difficulties of the Williams tube. It finally did arrive at a point where it was working, and for a period of time it served the purpose, but rather expensively. We had tubes that would store 1,000 bits. They cost about $1,000 to make, and they lasted about a month. That's $1 per bit per month of maintenance cost on the memory, which is a fairly expensive operation. There was a desperate search for better memory. We seriously considered at one stage renting a television microwave link from Boston to Buffalo and back, so that one could store something like 3,000 bits in the 3 milliseconds of round-trip transit time. Throughout this middle years of the project, from 1949 to 1953, we were in the position of having to radiate confidence about the storage tubes being good enough, while at the same time knowing they weren't. And it was in that climate that the development of the magnetic core storage took place. Actually, that development began in 1947 in an effort that I'd made to use glow discharge tubes in a matrix arrangement for storage. But again, they depended on secondary emission, they depended on gas discharge, they depended on the life of the device, the characteristics would change, it would depend on pressure and temperature, and it took very little experimenting to discourage us from going forward with that line. Then for a period of 2 years, we struggled with storage tubes, but kept in mind the possibility, the desire for a three-dimensional mode of storage. Another point then came, another turning point came out of the technical literature. I was perusing an article by Ernest Albers Schoenberg, a German ceramicist then working for the General Ceramics Company in New Jersey. And they had been selling ferrite cores for use in television yokes and television transformers. The initial ferrite cores were large. The first ones were even larger than this. This is a 16 by 16 array of cores made by Schoenberg. And he was indeed a remarkable man. It demonstrates that time after time, the art is far ahead of the science. He was able to make magnetic ferrites that would work in magnetic core storage out of his background of having made pottery in Germany. And I never watched him work, but one of our people who watched him work said he would put his hands in this black powder and run it through his fingers and say, "That feels square to me." And then he would press it and fire it. And every once in a while, he would get a batch with a few percent of cores that, in fact, were usable, which at the very least demonstrated that it could be done. It took MIT 2 years, probably $500,000, and the best talent we had in electrical engineering and physics to match what Schoenberg was able to do. By that time, we understood the 50 or so variables that were involved and could make essentially every batch turn out to be 98 or 99% yield. But the real start was through art and trial and error, as it so often is.
We did know how to make magnetic drums, that is, coat the surface of a rotating drum with magnetic material. It was an idea that came from Germany. But that was about it. Nobody had a high-speed memory until Jay came up with this brilliant idea. There's a frame holding an array of magnetic ferrite cores. You've seen these, you know what they are, but I'll just remind you what they are. These little donuts, very tiny, perhaps the size of a match head, were such that if you sent half the current necessary to make a core change its magnetism from this direction to that direction, you sent half of a current down this wire, let's say, and half of it down that wire, then only the core at the intersection could possibly change its state from one to another. And then you would sense that change on a common sense winding that ran through the array. Well, that was a real breakthrough.
The work progressed from the initial ideas in 1949 to eventually a memory large enough and complete enough that it ought to be tested. By that time, the Whirlwind computer was being used in the early air defense experiments, and we didn't want to upset it with an unproven memory. And even though these memories worked perfectly in individual planes, we were still very much an adherent to Murphy's laws, and we suspected there were still things we didn't understand and that ought to be tested in some full-scale manner. It is my recollection, partly reinforced by Norman Taylor reminding me every once in a while that I contended that Ken Olsen would not be able to make a full-scale computer in 9 months for testing this memory the way he wanted to, and I was much opposed to it, although he had the backing of Norman Taylor, the chief engineer, and perhaps it was part of the spirit of the laboratory that even though one didn't believe a proposition, sometimes you let it go ahead. In fact, it succeeded brilliantly. And in the spring of 1953, the memory test computer was running with the first bank of 32 by 32 memory. It worked without a flaw, and by August, 3 or 4 months later, that bank of memory had been moved into the Whirlwind computer, and the electrostatic storage tube operation, with a great sigh of relief, could be closed down.